You know, now having lived for some time in this world, I am sure of one thing. A nation whose children do not read books has no future. And now the question is, do you think our children enjoy reading? I know it's always easy to speak, but it's hard to act. So I decided to start with myself, or to be precise, with my child. I asked my son to read Sain Muratbekov's story, The Scent of Wormwood. At some point, I found him crying over this book. As a child, I read another short story written by this author, The Wild Apple Tree. Therefore, I knew that the author's language is accessible to children. And his work, The Scent of Wormwood, touched the most exquisite strings of my child's soul. This book moved my son to tears. So this story prompted me to choose this particular book for today's program. Aynur Toleo, poet and a literary critic, Master of Humanities and Literature Studies, laureate of the Beimbet Mylin Special Prize, winner of the Republican Poetry Competition dedicated to the 175th birth anniversary of Abai. Indeed, only a soulless person can read the story without shedding a tear or two. It's very difficult to read about the lives of those whose childhood was stolen by the Second World War, to read about the hardships they experienced. After all, these were small children who turned out to be involuntary witnesses of the confrontation between good and evil. These children who have passed through those hard years had different dreams. So what was your motivation to study when you were a child? I admit that some of us did not even think about it, although there were clearly those who were naturally curious and who dreamt of growing up as educated people. The characters in this book wanted to learn to read and write in order to write letters to their fathers who went to war. The war put an end to not only the dreams and fantasies of adults, but also the aspirations of children. There are no easy books about war, but the story The Scent of Wormwood, despite its severity, cannot be called a heavy one. On the contrary, it's easy to read in one breath, and it leaves this feeling of warmth in you once you finish. I read it, and it made me think, do I treat people well?
Қаншалықты мейірімдімін деген сұрақты өз-өзіме қоя бердім.
Sain Muratbekov was a writer and playwright. He was born on October 15, 1936 in the village of Konyr, Kapal district, Almaty region. From 1957 to 1963, he studied at Kazakh State University. In 1971, he graduated from the higher literary courses in Moscow. He was awarded the Badge of Honor and Honored Worker of the Republic of Kazakhstan title. He was also laureate of the State Prize. The writer's works have been translated into Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, Lithuanian, and Arabic languages. Many key facts from Sain Muratbekov's biography were described by him in the Wild Apple Tree story. Sain's father went to the war, so the boy was raised by his grandfather. The phrase "once upon a time there lived an orphan," which an attentive reader can often come across in his The Scent of Wormwood book, is a reflection of the author's fate. Sain was only 6 when his mother Rizia died, so he was left completely alone. Muratbekov was a master of short stories. He was distinguished by his incredible ability to fit the concepts worthy of a novel into a shorter narrative. Therefore, Muratbekov can be called the successor of Beimbet Mylin, who was a pioneer of this genre. Literary critics talked of the writer as the lyric poet of the prose, meaning that his writings emanated the free spirit of the steppe. And personally, I can say that after finishing his books, I always sense this aftertaste of wild apples and wormwood scent. This genuine steppe aroma that is dear to any Kazakh. In summers, a cool breeze blows from Jusan Tobe. It brings the bitter smell of wormwood. At such moments, I always remember Ayan. Believe it or not, ever since I have read this book, it only takes me to smell the wormwood to remember Ayan.
Сыршыл суреткердің
The story of the lyric writer, The Smell of Wormwood, is a work that stands out in Kazakh literature because of its very special charm.
кейіпкер
The reader can easily understand the characters because they speak the same language.
керісінше бұл еңбек
The story is understandable and accessible to both adults and children.
әрі жеңіл.
The protagonist of the book is an orphan named Ayan.
Бала
He loves to make up tales.
ұнатады.
He's very smart and he was the first to learn to read and write at school.
Бәрінен бұрын
He
үйреніп
has
алады.
all the positive characteristics of a truly exemplary boy.
Образын жинақтаған.
Ayan is patient. He never confronts anyone. If necessary, he can stand up to a bully, to Yesikbai, for instance, another protagonist.
Әжесі қайтыс болған.
Even when the boy's grandmother died, when the report on his father's death arrived, when he dislocated his ankle and suffered from pain at work, he didn't show his tears to anyone.
баласына көрсетпейді.
The protagonist might not cry, but the reader cannot be indifferent to his sufferings.
жүрегі елжіреп,
The author managed to create a completely typical image which is capable of touching the depths of the reader's soul, and this is the very essence of mastery.
шеберлік.
Essays on military theme make up a significant part of Kazakh literature. After all, about 1.5 million Kazakhstanis fought in the Second World War. The unity of the front and the home front was glorified by the famous poet Hamid Yergali. His poem, Father's Confession, is still relevant today. The work of Kasim Amanjolov, The Legend of the Death of a Poet, tells the story of a poet who died fighting for a peaceful sky. The writings of Baujan Mamushulu, a war veteran who fought with great courage in the Moscow battles, also describe the events of the war years.
Аян кім? Аянның аянышты
Who
тағдыры.
is Ayan? His character is a collective image that personifies the fate of all children of the war.
образ деп айтамыз. Тура осы кейіпкер
Back then, many kids who barely got on their feet were forced to work tirelessly in the rear front.
секілдесінде көп еді.
The war robbed them of their childhood. It took away fatherly love and motherly affection,
Бірінен айырды. Бапай және
things which cause compassion in the reader. The sorrows of an orphan boy nevertheless leave Bapai and Turjan, adult characters in the book, indifferent.
сезімін туғызады, ойландырады.
And it
Себебі
makes you think.
ағалардың соғысқа
The
кетуінің
fathers and brothers of these children died in the war, protecting their homeland, their villages, their family and children.
түптарын ауыр зұлматтан
They went to
арашалау
war to fight against the invaders, to find the brutality and injustice.
бейнесі арқылы
But through Turjan's character, the writer demonstrated that cruelty and heartlessness are not necessarily intrinsic to war, as they exist everywhere.
айтқысы келгендей.
Sain Muratbekov didn't write novels. His novels are his stories, and his stories will live forever. Isn't this happiness for a writer? Vakhtjan Maitanov, literary critic.
Сонымен қатар Мұратбеков
Muratbekov wrote a short story entitled Turjan Executioner.
сұрапыл
The story describes the cruelty with which orphans or widowed women were treated during the war.
аналарға көрсетіп
And those were not isolated cases. So Turjan from the Scent of Wormwood story is also a very typical character of those days.
кейіпкер. Жусанның есі
The smell of wormwood is the smell of the steppe.
осы шығарманы оқып
It is said that some readers, after reading the story, dreamt of seeing the special plant growing in the Kazakh steppes.
болған екен. Жусан исі деген
Even the very phrase, the scent of wormwood, reflects the national philosophy.
жан сарайыңды ашатын жусан жұпары туралы идеяны
Only such a classic author as Muratbekov could explain this with the words of a child.
құдіреті жетеді. Эй, мен сендерге
Hey, want to hear something interesting? He asked happily. Today before dawn, I saw my father in my dream. That's true.
түсімде ағамды көрдім. Рас айтам.
Before going to bed, I put my father's coat under my head and smelled it for some time. And the coat smelled like my father. It was such a pleasant aroma, similar to the smell of wormwood. I buried my nose in the collar and sniffed it for a long, long time. Grandmother often used to say, I gave birth to your father on that wormwood hillock when I was moving cattle in the pasture. I gave birth right in the steppe.
тапқанмын дейтін.
That's why the smell of wormwood is the smell of my father. I fell asleep on my father's coat, and I saw him in my dream.
Ағам кірді. иә
Indeed, Ayan's father was born in the Pelovskian Wormwood steppe. That is why his son Ayan dreamt of his father returning to his home turf.
әке туған
And Ayan believes in it.
оралуы тиіс. Аян соған
Children, having heard his story, started to smell one another.
істеп көреді. Байқас
And as it turned out, they also smelled of wormwood.
аңқып тұр екен.
This smell is intrinsic to me and you, too.
Де шығады. Ұлы далада
It seems to me that all people and animals that live in the great steppe are bound by the steppe scent.
байланыстырып тұрғандай.
In the blossoming garden of our multinational literature, the wonderful prose of Sain Muratbekov, like a young tree, attracts enthusiastic gazes from afar. Gabit Musrepov, writer.
Иіс идея
Muratbekov introduced a new trend in Kazakh literature. The novelty he brought to the literature was to speak with the reader, appealing to his instincts, such as smell. Animals living in the wilderness recognize and find each other by smell. An infant, who has not yet acquired the skill of socialization, recognizes his mother and relatives by smell. So the hero of the story, Ayan, wants to say to the adult villagers, to the society, and to humanity as a whole, just smell me. I am just like you, a steppe dweller. My smell is your smell. I'm not a stranger. But the old man and woman who adopted him and the cruel Turjan do not want to recognize their loved one in Ayan. Only children, free from political and human biases, take him for their own. And when Ayan, after all his ordeals in the village, is taken to the orphanage, those children say their farewells to him with regret. The master of literature, writer Sain Muratbekov, had the rarest gift, as he was the author who was able to depict human existence very subtly and realistically in his works. And this is exactly what wins readers' hearts. Sain is our national treasure. His works are timeless. If not today, then tomorrow he will definitely find his readers, no matter what nationality they are. Sherhan Murtaza, writer.
мен тіпті бір ай
I would say that Ayan's fate is about people who yearned for their relatives fighting in the war. Ayan's love for fairy tales, the way he admires the scent of wormwood, his starvation, his hard work gathering grains, and the words he told himself and others. Everyone can cry, but if you're strong, then try not to cry. Be a real man.
аштықтан
These all are real experiences people had during the war years.
жағдай ғой. Демек,
In his works, Sain Muratbekov portrayed a classic image of the Kazakh village and introduced it to international literature.
классика
He didn't have many works, but the ones he wrote were all highly valued by his contemporaries.
жоғары бағалайтын.
The
Қаламгердің
writer also left his mark in the art of cinema. He wrote scripts to several films. Satybaldy Narymbetov's Autumn Winding Roads, Ul Tugan, film about the tragedy of the Aral Sea directed by Yesikbai Buluzbayev, as well as the script to the famous film about friendship and brotherly love, Return of the Sun by Sharip Bisembayev.
Сайын Мұратбеков. Орыстың белгілі
The
жазушы
famous Russian writer Vasily Shukshin, having read the works of Sain Muratbekov, called him his Kazakh brother and soulmate. And this should not come as a surprise.
екен. 60
In
жылда
the 60s, the Soviet country was going through the so-called period of stagnation. This was reflected in the literature as well. Everyone would just write slogan-like texts, "We are the winners, we defeated the enemy in the war."
соғыста жеңіске жеткенбіз деген
However, Sain Muratbekov abandoned this declarative tone and tried to dig deeper into the inner world of his heroes.
әлеміне үңілді. Оқи қалсаң, жан
This is how his characters were born, sincere, with their souls wide open, realistic, earthly. And that's interesting that they remain relevant today.
шен болатыны. Содан
Society is changing, political systems are subject to changes too,
жан
but the human soul will always be striving for sincerity and perfection. Therefore, readers who yearn for the smell of wormwood and are hungry for the sensation of purity will always be fans of Muratbekov's books.